The gun was already in Monroe Sutton's hand when Edith Monroe walked through the door of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office, and the look on his face, that hard, unreadable, iron-carved expression she had spent 6 months trying to crack open, told her everything she had been afraid to believe. He had known all along. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, and her voice didn't shake the way she thought it would. She had rehearsed this moment in the back of her mind for weeks, preparing herself for the possibility, constructing walls against the heartbreak. But no wall she had ever built was thick enough for this. "Tell me you didn't know about my father when you came to Harrowfield. Tell me you didn't come looking for me." Monroe Sutton set the gun down on the scarred oak desk with a slowness that felt deliberate, like a man placing every word before he spoke it. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes, usually still as a winter lake, were moving across her face with something that looked dangerously close to pain. "I can't tell you that," he said. The betrayal hit her like a physical thing, like the flat of a hand against her sternum. She had trusted this man. She had given him parts of herself she had never handed to anyone, whispered things in the dark, leaned into the solid warmth of him, let herself believe that a man as closed and quiet and impenetrable as Monroe Sutton had chosen to open just for her, just because of her. "You used me," she said. "No." His voice was rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel. "I came here for a reason that had nothing to do with love. What happened between us, that was not part of any plan I ever made." "But you knew," she said. "You knew about the hidden motive. You knew about my father's involvement with Crane's men. You knew there was a trap being set, and you let me walk around this territory thinking I was just a woman trying to build a life. Edith, don't." She held up one hand and the word came out sharp as a whip crack. "Don't say my name like that right now." The room between them felt enormous, though it wasn't more than 10 feet of dusty plank floor and failing afternoon light. Outside, Dusty Creek was going about its business. The clank of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter of men outside the saloon, the ordinary sounds of a life she had thought was finally becoming hers. Monroe Sutton looked at her like a man who had just watched something irreplaceable fall from a great height. "Sit down," he said quietly. "Please, let me tell you everything from the beginning, the real beginning." She didn't sit, but she didn't leave, and that, she would realize much later, was where the real story started. 6 months earlier, Edith Monroe had arrived in the New Mexico Territory on a Wednesday in April of 1882, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway line at the Dusty Creek Depot with a trunk, a carpet bag, a letter of employment, and a very clear sense of what she was running from. Her father, Gerald Monroe, had been the magistrate of a small Kansas town called Harrowfield for 20 years. He was a man of appearances, Sunday suits, firm handshakes, the kind of civic authority that made people comfortable enough to stop asking questions. Edith had worshipped him as a child. She had spent her 20s discovering, one slow, devastating revelation at a time, that the man she had worshipped was not the man he appeared to be. Gerald Monroe had, for at least a decade, been taking payments from a criminal organization, operating throughout the Kansas and New Mexico territories, under the direction of a man named Ellis Crane. Crane ran cattle theft rings, land fraud schemes, and occasionally worse. He operated through intermediaries, middlemen who gave the whole enterprise a layer of legal plausibility, and one of those middlemen had been Edith's father. She had found out by accident, the way people usually found out things they were not supposed to know. A letter left open on her father's desk. A name she recognized from a trial that had gone mysteriously wrong. Numbers that didn't add up in ledgers she had helped keep since she was 17. She had spent 2 months building her certainty before she confronted her father, and the confrontation had ended with Gerald Monroe telling her quietly that she did not understand the nature of necessity, that she would be wise to forget what she thought she knew, and that certain men had very long reaches. It had sounded like a warning. It had felt like a threat. Edith had packed her trunk the following week, and answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher position in a New Mexico Territory town called Dusty Creek. She had told herself it was a fresh start. She had told herself she was brave. She had not told herself she was also terrified, because admitting that would have made it too hard to get on the train. Dusty Creek in April of 1882 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. It sat in the high desert east of the Rio Grande, surrounded by red rock and dry grass and the kind of enormous sky that made people feel either free or very small. It had a single main street with a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a smithy, and a post office. It had a school with 32 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, which was where Edith would spend her days. It had a population of roughly 300 people, many of whom looked at the new schoolteacher with the open curiosity of people who had not had a stranger arrive in some time, and it had Monroe Sutton. She had noticed him the first day, which was not remarkable. Monroe Sutton was the kind of man people noticed. He was tall and lean in the way of men who did hard physical work, with wide shoulders and hands that were scarred in ways that told a story she couldn't read yet. He had dark hair that was long enough to curl slightly at the collar of his coat, and those gray eyes that seemed to take in everything and give back nothing. He was 31 years old. He worked as a deputy for the territorial marshal's office, stationed in Dusty Creek to manage law enforcement for the surrounding region. He ate breakfast at the hotel dining room every morning at 6:30, said no more than necessary to anyone, and had been in the territory for about 8 months before Edith arrived. The town had opinions about Monroe Sutton. "He's not unfriendly exactly," the hotel's proprietress, a stout woman named Clara Hatch, told Edith during her first week. Clara had appointed herself Edith's primary source of local information, with a cheerfulness that brooked no argument. "He just doesn't let anybody in. You can talk at him for an hour and feel like you've learned nothing. Dark past, people say, though nobody knows exactly what kind." "Has he always been a lawman?" Edith asked out of polite interest, nothing more. "Came here as a deputy. Did some work before that nobody talks about clearly. You know how men are out here, half of them are running from something." Clara lowered her voice conspiratorially, though they were alone. "There's a rumor he used to ride with some rough company before he took the Star. Reformed outlaw, some say. But he does his job clean, and he doesn't drink himself stupid, and he doesn't bother women, which puts him ahead of a fair number of men in this territory." Edith had filed this information away and gone back to preparing her lessons. She did not intend to get involved with Monroe Sutton. She was not in Dusty Creek for involvement. She was here to teach children their letters and their numbers and perhaps their history, to build a quiet life at a safe distance from everything that had gone wrong in Harrowfield, and to figure out what she was going to do about what she knew about her father. The first time Monroe Sutton spoke directly to her, it was because of a runaway horse. It was the 3rd week of April, a warm afternoon with a dry wind coming off the desert, and Edith was walking back from the schoolhouse when a horse tied outside the general store. Not properly tied, she would discover later. The owner had been careless about the hitch, spooked at something, and came loose, heading straight down the main street at a frightened gallop. Edith, who had grown up around horses and knew better than to freeze, stepped into the street and used a technique her grandfather had taught her, spreading her arms and making herself large, and then going suddenly still, breaking the horse's momentum with the unexpected obstacle of a human being who was not running away. The horse slowed. Edith reached up and caught the trailing rein and spoke quietly, steadily, until the animal stopped trembling. When she turned around, Monroe Sutton was standing 10 feet away, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't classify. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. "That was well done," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Where did you learn to handle a frightened horse like that?" "My grandfather kept horses. He said the worst thing you can do when something is frightened is to show it that you are too." Something moved through Monroe Sutton's gray eyes, something quick and private that was gone before she could identify it. "Good advice," he said. for more situations than horses. He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, and that was the whole conversation. But Edith found herself thinking about it that evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that, which was when she began to understand that she was in some degree of trouble. The secrets of Monroe Sutton revealed themselves the way secrets always did in the Wild West, in pieces, through other people, through the spaces between what a man said and what he didn't. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Sam Delray who had known Monroe for several months, told her over a fence one afternoon that Monroe Sutton had once tracked a gang of men who had burned a homesteader family's property clear to the Arizona border without a single deputy backing him up. Brought back the two men responsible, Sam said, with a note of something like reverence. By himself. Took 3 weeks. Nobody knows exactly what happened out in that desert, and Monroe won't say. But those 2 men stood trial, and they stood it peaceable. The schoolchildren told her things without knowing they were telling her anything. One boy named Charlie Hobart had an older brother who sometimes helped Monroe Sutton on errands, and through Charlie, Edith learned that Monroe occasionally disappeared from town for 2 or 3 days at a time, returning dusty and tight-lipped, and spending the evening sitting outside his rented room staring at nothing. That he gave most of his deputy pay to a widow woman on the edge of town who had too many children and not enough cattle. That he had a horse named Reason that he talked to in a way he never talked to people. She learned these things without asking. They came to her the way things come to a schoolteacher, because she listened, and because people trusted her with things they couldn't always articulate why they were sharing. But the man himself remained closed. He spoke to her occasionally. At the hotel dining room, in passing on the street, once when he stopped by the school to speak to her about a student who was having difficulty at home and needed a patient teacher's attention. Each conversation was polite, direct, and contained. He answered questions without elaborating. He asked questions occasionally, about her background, about teaching, about whether she had settled well into the town, with a focused attention that made her feel like the only person in the room, and then he would nod and excuse himself, and that focused attention would close down again like a shutter across a window. "You've been watching him," Clara Hatch said one evening over supper, in the pleasant knowing way of a woman who watched everything. "I haven't," Edith said. "You have, and so has he. Monroe Sutton watches everyone. It's his job." "He doesn't watch everyone the way he watches you," Clara said comfortably. "Now eat your beans before they get cold." It was the middle of May when the first real crack appeared. Edith had been walking home from the schoolhouse late, having stayed to prepare materials for the following week, and had taken the longer road because the evening was beautiful, all copper and violet in the sky, the air carrying the faint sweetness of desert flowers after a brief afternoon rain. She had rounded a corner near the edge of town and found Monroe Sutton sitting on the low wooden fence that bordered an empty lot, with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, not looking at anything. She should have walked past. She knew she should have. He was a private man, and she was well aware of it. Instead, before she had fully decided to, she stopped. "Are you all right?" she said. He looked up. For just a fraction of a second before the habitual blankness reasserted itself, his face was completely open, tired, and something else, something older and harder to name. She had the sensation of looking through a window into a room she had not been invited to enter. "I'm fine," he said. "You don't look fine." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, "I had a difficult day." "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," he said. Then, "Sit down if you like." She sat on the fence beside him, not close enough to be forward, close enough to be company. They sat in silence while the sky darkened through its spectrum of colors. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it, that felt like it meant something. "I found out today," Monroe said eventually, "that a man I thought I knew was not who I thought he was." Edith said nothing. She waited. "It happens," he continued, looking out at the desert where the last light was turning the red rocks into something almost otherworldly. "A man shows you one face. You make judgments based on that face, and then you find out the face was a construction and the thing underneath it is considerably darker. Was he dangerous? Edith asked. Yes. Are you in danger? A brief pause. Not immediately. She studied his profile, the clean, hard line of jaw and brow, the way he held himself even at rest like something braced against a wind. I'm sorry, she said. Discovering that someone you trusted has been hiding a dark past is one of the worst feelings there is. Monroe turned his head and looked at her, and there was a sharpness in that look, a sudden particular attention. You know something about that, he said. It was not quite a question. I know something about that, she agreed quietly. They sat with that shared knowledge between them like something placed carefully on a table, neither of them picking it up. Then Monroe Sutton said, very quietly, I'm sorry too, Miss Monroe. They walked back toward town together in the gathering dark, and they didn't say much more, but something had changed. Some small, specific thing had shifted between them. Edith felt it and knew it, and lay awake later thinking about a man who was difficult to know, and the strange comfort of sitting beside him in silence while the desert turned to night. June arrived in the New Mexico territory with a heat that rose off the red earth in visible waves, and with it came a deepening of the something between Edith Monroe and Monroe Sutton that neither of them acknowledged out loud. He began to walk her home from the hotel on the evenings when he was in town, falling into step beside her without invitation and without ceremony, as if it were a thing that had simply been decided somewhere in the agreement of two people who were beginning to understand each other. He still did not talk easily, but he began to talk. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, in a town called Benton Crossing, the third of 4 brothers. That his father had been a man of violent temperament who had made the Monroe Sutton home a fearful place. And this he said flatly, without seeking sympathy, as if stating a fact of geography. That he had left at 17 and spent several years in a period of his life he described only as bad company and worse decisions, which she understood from context meant something close to lawlessness, though he did not elaborate and she did not push. That a man named Jacob Fell, a territorial marshal operating out of Albuquerque, had offered him an alternative when Monroe was 23, a chance to use the particular skills that bad company had given him on the correct side of a line that mattered. Did you take it immediately? She asked one evening, sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse in the blue-gold light of late afternoon, where they had somehow found themselves after Monroe had stopped to tell her about a family who had recently arrived and whose youngest children would be starting school. No, he said. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. What made you decide? He looked at his hands. They were resting on his knees, those scarred hands with their evidence of a hard history. A woman was killed, he said. A homesteader woman, out on the edge of the territory. The men I was riding with at the time, I won't call them friends, but they were my company, they were responsible. I didn't pull a trigger, but I was there and I didn't stop it, and that is a thing I have to carry. He paused. I decided I was done carrying things in the wrong direction. Edith sat with this. She did not flinch from it, and she did not offer absolution he hadn't asked for. What she said was, that kind of decision to turn yourself around at that age to become something different that takes a particular kind of strength. Or a particular kind of guilt, he said. Both things can be true at once, she said. He looked at her sideways, that considering look she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise. You say things plainly, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's not a problem at all. What grew between them was not rapid or electric the way stories made love sound. It was slower and more like geology, the accumulation of small moments pressing into something that could bear weight. The way he remembered without being reminded that she preferred her coffee without sugar. The way she learned to read the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had come back from somewhere difficult and needed quiet rather than conversation. The way they could sit together and think separately and not feel the need to fill the space. She began to understand the things he didn't say. He would stop mid-sentence sometimes, in the way of a man who had caught himself about to offer more than he intended, and pull back, and she learned not to chase those pulled-back things but to wait, because often he came back to them an hour or a day later when he decided they were safe to give. He had a sense of humor that was dry as the desert and appeared without warning, a brief, unexpected wit that surfaced and then submerged before you were quite sure you'd seen it. He was meticulous in his work in a way that some people took for coldness, but Edith recognized as care. Everything he did completely. He was, she had decided by the time July arrived and the heat was at its fullest, the most genuinely private person she had ever known. Not secretive in the way her father was secretive, not concealing things for dark and selfish purposes, but private in the way of a person who had been hurt by exposure and had learned very carefully what the walls were for. She was, she thought, beginning to understand him. She was not yet entirely right about that. The first real kiss happened on a Tuesday evening in July, with the smell of coming rain in the air and heat lightning, making silent theater of the horizon to the south. They had been walking back from a gathering at the Delray house. Sam and his wife Nell held occasional supper gatherings that pulled in half the town, warm occasions full of food and music, and the particular sociability of frontier people who knew the value of community. Monroe had attended because Sam had specifically requested his company, and he had sat through most of the evening with the contained politeness he showed in social situations, deflecting the more personal questions that well-meaning townspeople regularly aimed at him. On the walk back, Edith had said, "You find those gatherings difficult." "I find them," he stopped, started again. "I don't dislike people. I don't know how to be easy with them in groups." "That's not true," she said. "You're very good with individuals. I've watched you with people who are frightened or in trouble. You're extraordinarily steady." "That's different," he said. "That's a function. I know what I'm supposed to be in that situation." "And what are you supposed to be in the social situation?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I never learned it." They had arrived outside the schoolhouse, which stood near the path between the Delray house and the hotel where Edith boarded. The lightning to the south was more frequent now, and the air had that electric, iron-and-drain quality that preceded a desert storm. Edith stopped and turned to face him. "Monroe," she said. She used his given name rarely and carefully, and when she did, he always went very still. "Can I ask you something directly?" "You can ask me anything directly," he said. "What is happening between us?" she said. "Because something is, and I'm tired of circling it." In the lightning-flickered silence, she watched him think about this. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it carefully, the way he did everything carefully. Then he said, "I don't know what to call it. I know," a pause. "I know that you are the first person in a very long time who I have wanted to be near. That when you are not in a room, I notice the absence. That you have a manner of understanding things." He stopped again, started again with visible effort. "I think about you when I am not with you, considerably." "That's quite a lot to say for you," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." "I think about you considerably too," she said. The storm arrived from the south with a rush of cool air and the first fat drops of rain, and Monroe Sutton stepped forward and kissed her, with his hands holding her face as if she were something he was afraid of letting go. It was not tentative. It was not a man who didn't know what he wanted. It was thorough and certain, and it went on for long enough that the rain had begun in earnest by the time they separated. They stood in the rain looking at each other, both of them slightly wet and slightly astonished by the weight of the thing that had just been acknowledged. "Good night, Edith," he said. "Good night, Monroe," she said. She went inside and stood in the entry of the hotel with water dripping from the brim of her hat, and she was smiling so hard her face hurt. August brought heat and happiness, and also, working at the edges of both, the first stirrings of something that made Edith uneasy. Monroe Sutton was called away to Albuquerque twice in August, on business he was vague about, returning both times with a preoccupied tension that took several days to ease. She didn't question him. She had learned his rhythms well enough to know that pushing in the wrong moment only caused him to close more tightly. But she noticed. She also noticed that he occasionally asked her questions about Harrowfield. Not often, not pointedly, woven into conversations about her childhood and her father with a naturalness that could have been genuine curiosity. She noticed because she was, by profession and temperament, a careful observer, and she had noticed that his questions about her past had a particular shape. They circled around her father, around what Gerald Monroe did, around the business of a magistrate in a Kansas town, with a focus that felt like more than idle interest. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself this was the old damage speaking, the particular wariness of a woman who had learned that someone she trusted had hidden depths, and that she was projecting it onto a man who had given her no real reason for suspicion. She wanted this to be true. She wanted it badly enough that she almost succeeded in believing it. In early September, Ellis Crane came to Dusty Creek. He did not come as himself. He came as a cattle buyer from Texas, a broad, prosperous man named John Vale, with a big laugh and an expensive suit and excellent manners. He spent 3 days in town, doing business at the saloon and the hotel and making himself generally agreeable, and then he left. Nobody thought much about it except Edith. Because Edith had seen a photograph of Ellis Crane, which she had found in her father's desk in a moment that had changed the direction of her life. She recognized the jaw, the build, the way the man carried his considerable physical presence. She was not certain. The photograph had been small and worn, but she was sufficiently certain to be afraid. She said nothing to Monroe. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she was still not fully trusting the ground of her own perceptions after months of deciding to trust him. Perhaps because some part of her was calculating, the cautious, self-protecting part that had learned from her father's betrayal to not show her hand prematurely. She spent 3 days in a state of quiet, contained anxiety, running over what she knew and what it might mean, and on the 4th day after John Vale's departure, she made a decision. She went to the territorial marshal's office in Dusty Creek, a small building on the north side of the main street, and she knocked on the door. The deputy marshal who answered was not Monroe. It was his colleague, a young man named Pete Aldrin, who told her that Deputy Sutton was out of town for the day and would be back by evening. Edith thanked him and left, telling herself she would speak to Monroe that evening. And then, because life in the Wild West was not given to convenient timing, she ran into old Jim Cassler outside the general store. Jim Cassler was 70 years old and had been living in the New Mexico Territory for 30 of those years, and he had, as old men with time and no particular restraint often did, a complete fund of other people's information. He had lived in a dozen territories and known 100 men, and he was the type to share what he knew if you stood still long enough. What Jim Cassler shared that afternoon, leaning against the wall of the general store with the sun on his face and a peaceful lack of awareness that he was detonating something, was that he had known Monroe Sutton before Dusty Creek. Came through Harrowfield, Kansas about 2 years back, Jim said, in the way of a man making pleasant conversation about mutual acquaintances. Doing work for the Federal Territory Office he was, looking into some business with a fellow named Crane, Ellis Crane. You know of him. Edith's blood went cold in the August heat. No, she said carefully, I don't believe I do. Nasty piece of work, Crane, criminal in 3 territories. You're part of Kansas too, I believe, Harrowfield area. Jim scratched his chin. Sutton was there for weeks, asking questions about a local official, I believe, a magistrate or some such. He looked at her with the genial interest of a man who still hadn't connected the dots. Monroe, I believe his name was, that your father. I really must be getting home, Edith said. Good day, Jim. She walked to the hotel with her hands steady and her heart hammering, and she sat in her room with the door locked, and she thought about everything. Monroe Sutton had been in Harrowfield 2 years ago. He had been investigating Ellis Crane and her father. He had then appeared in Dusty Creek, the town where Edith Monroe, the daughter of a man under federal investigation, had taken employment. She thought about the questions, the careful, woven-in questions about her father in Harrowfield. She thought about the trips to Albuquerque, the preoccupied tension on his return. She thought about the way he had found her on the street that first day, and the thought ran through her mind, cold and devastating, was that an accident? She thought about everything he had shown her, the slow, difficult opening of a man not used to opening, the vulnerability that had felt so real it had rearranged something fundamental in her. And she thought, what if it was a performance? What if she had been used as a source of information about her father? What if the dark past he'd shared was a tool for earning her trust, and the kiss in the rain was a technique? She did not want to believe this. She was desperately afraid that she believed it. She sat in her room until she heard his horse come down the main street at 7 in the evening, and then she got up, and she walked to the sheriff's office, and she walked through the door and said the words, "Tell me it isn't true." And Monroe Sutton said, "I can't tell you that." In the aftermath of those words, in the long, charged, terrible silence, Monroe Sutton stood up from the desk. "I came to Harrowfield as part of an investigation," he said. He spoke carefully, looking at her directly, the way he always did when something mattered. Gerald Monroe had been under suspicion of involvement with Crane's operations for 2 years. The evidence was indirect and difficult to prosecute. The Federal Territory Office believed that if we could establish a direct connection through a witness who had access to Gerald Monroe's private communications, we could build a case. "A witness," Edith said. The word had a flat, terrible quality in the air. "That was the thinking initially," he said. "I was in Harrowfield for 6 weeks. I identified you as a potential asset, someone who worked closely with your father and might have access to information." He paused. "I was supposed to make contact, to cultivate your trust and gather information through you. And then," she said, "and then I went back to Albuquerque and told the territorial office that I didn't think you knew what your father was involved in, that you were not an asset to be cultivated, that I thought you were an innocent party who might be in danger if the investigation moved forward publicly." Another pause, longer this time. "They told me to come to Dusty Creek, that you had taken a position here, that I should continue to monitor the situation." "They sent you here to spy on me," she said. "They sent me here to monitor the situation," he repeated. "Edith, I need you to hear the difference between what they sent me to do and what I actually did." "What difference?" she said. "You're here because of me. You came here with an agenda." "I came here with an assignment," he said. "The assignment was to gather intelligence. What I actually did, for the past 6 months, was fall in love with you." The words fell into the room like stones into water, sending rings outward that she could feel against her ribs. "That's very convenient," she said. "It is not convenient," he said, and there was something in his voice now raw, controlled, real. "It is the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me. I am a man who does not allow himself involvement. I am a man who maintains necessary distance, because necessary distance is how I have survived. You walked into this town and dismantled every single thing I used to keep distance, and you did it so quietly, so steadily, so completely that by the time I understood what had happened, there was nothing left to dismantle." She looked at him for a long time. "Monroe," she said, "did you share anything about me with the territorial office, about my father?" "No," he said immediately. "Nothing. No information I gave you, nothing you observed." "Nothing that you told me," he said. "Nothing that came from our relationship. Anything I've communicated upward has been gathered from other sources." He held her gaze. "I have been protecting you from this investigation for months. The trips to Albuquerque, I was arguing against a course of action that would have forced you into an impossible position." "What course of action?" He came around the desk and stood closer to her, not reaching for her, giving her space, but near enough that she could see his face clearly in the lamplight. "The Territory Office wanted to formally depose you as a witness against your father," he said. "They were going to compel your testimony. I have been arguing that this was unnecessary because I was developing other avenues of evidence. That is true. What is also true is that I would have found any excuse available to keep you out of the center of this." Edith felt the anger shifting inside her, not dissolving, not yet, but changing shape. She was still shaking with the betrayal, still feeling the cold place where certainty had been. But she was also a woman who dealt in honesty, And the honesty of what she was observing was that this man, this closed, difficult, impenetrable man, was showing her everything right now. No deflection. No retreat into silence. He was standing in front of her completely open, and it was costing him visibly. "The man who visited last month," she said. "John Vale, I think that was Ellis Crane." Monroe went absolutely still. "Why do you think that?" "I saw a photograph of Crane in my father's desk 2 years ago," she said. "I recognized him." "Did Crane see you recognize him?" "I don't believe so." Monroe exhaled slowly, and she could see him processing this, rearranging information, and underneath it something that looked like relief mixed with alarm. "If that was Crane," he said, "then he's moved his operations closer. He may know the investigation is active. This town, this position," he looked at her with an urgency that was not professional. "You may be in danger." "I've been in danger since I read my father's mail," she said. "Edith," her name in his mouth, careful and specific. "I am so sorry for the way this started. For the assignment I came here carrying. For the weeks when I was watching you before I had any understanding of what you were going to be to me." He stopped. His hands were at his sides, not reaching, restrained. "I cannot undo what I was sent here to do. I can tell you that every conversation we have had, every evening, every moment of honesty I gave you, none of that was performance. None of it was strategy. I am not good enough an actor for what I have shown you." She believed him. That was the thing that was simultaneously breaking her and mending her. She believed him because she had spent 6 months learning every part of Monroe Sutton, and what she had learned was that this was not a man who performed warmth. If anything, it was a man who was constitutionally incapable of performing it, a man so habituated to closed self-containment that the opening had been visible in its difficulty, raw in its rarity. She had not been manipulated into trusting him. She had observed him honestly, and trust had been the honest result. "I'm still angry," she said. "I know," he said. I need some time. I need tonight to think, and I need you to give me that without whatever you need," he said immediately. "All the time you need." She left the sheriff's office and walked back to the hotel, and she cried for an hour. Not from devastation, exactly, but from the complex exhaustion of having felt so many things in such a short time, and from the tenderness of knowing that she was going to forgive him, and that forgiving him was going to require her to be braver than she had been in a very long time. The following morning, Monroe Sutton appeared at the hotel at 7 o'clock and asked for a few minutes of Edith Monroe's time. Clara Hatch, who had heard some portion of the previous night's drama through the thin walls of her establishment and was vibrating with curiosity, showed him to the small sitting room with exaggerated propriety, and then found urgent reasons to remain in the vicinity. Edith came downstairs in her school dress with her hair pinned up and her face composed, and sat across from Monroe Sutton at the small table where she had eaten 100 breakfasts. He looked like a man who had not slept. She probably did too. "I want to know everything," she said. "The investigation, where it stands, what risk my father is in, what risk I'm in, all of it. No more protected partial information." "All right," he said. He told her. He spread the whole thing across the table between them: Gerald Monroe's involvement with Crane going back 11 years, the land fraud and the cattle theft, and 2 disappearances of people who had threatened to expose the operation, the Federal Territory Office's patient assembly of a case, and the fact that they were now 6 to 8 weeks away from having enough evidence to move for arrest without needing Edith's testimony at all. "My father will be arrested," she said. "Yes." She sat with this. She had known it was coming. She had spent 2 years preparing herself for it. It still felt like a door closing on something she could not recover. And Crane. Crane is more difficult. He has multiple layers of legal protection: lawyers, intermediaries, the appearance of legitimate business. We have enough for the Kansas charges, but the New Mexico Territory charges are stronger. We need one more piece of evidence. "What piece?" Monroe met her eyes. "There's a set of accounting ledgers, records of payments made through Crane's operation to a network of officials and intermediaries, including your father. We believe these ledgers exist. We believe Crane keeps them as insurance leverage against anyone who might turn on him. If those ledgers surface, the case is closed. Multiple arrests. Crane in federal custody. Where are they? Unknown, he said. Crane had a man in Dusty Creek 3 weeks ago, John Vale, if that was indeed Crane himself, and the timing suggests he may have cached something here or nearby. But we don't know where. Edith looked out the window at the main street of Dusty Creek, already coming to life in the morning sun. She thought about her father, the man in the Sunday suit, the man she had worshipped, the man who had looked at her across his desk and told her to forget what she thought she knew. She thought about the homesteader families whose land had been stolen, the people whose lives had been bent wrong by the weight of Ellis Crane's operation. She thought about what complicity looked like and felt like when you stood beside it without acting. "I want to help," she said. "No," Monroe said quickly and firmly. "Monroe, this is not a situation where civilians— I am not a civilian in the relevant sense," she said. "I have more knowledge of my father's methods and the way Crane's intermediaries operate than any person in the Territory office. I have a direct connection to this situation, and I have been living with it for 2 years. And if Crane knows my father has a daughter who might be a witness, then I am already implicated in this whether I choose to act or not." She looked at him steadily. "Let me help. Use me correctly this time." Monroe Sutton looked at her for a long moment. She could see him fighting the instinct to protect, to close her away from risk, and she could also see him, because she had learned him, recognizing that she was right. "Within limits," he said. "Within reason," she agreed. Clara Hatch, listening from the hallway, made a small, satisfied sound and went to attend to her other guests. The plan that took shape over the following week was careful and specific. It centered on a theory Monroe had been developing, that if John Vale was Ellis Crane, and if Crane had stopped in Dusty Creek rather than simply passing through, he had likely been meeting someone here. A contact, a local intermediary, someone who could hold or transmit important documents. The most likely candidate was a man named Doyle Fenwick, who ran a freighting operation out of Dusty Creek and whose cargo routes ran into Kansas, New Mexico, and Texas. Fenwick was not suspected of criminal activity on his own account, but he was the kind of businessman who did not ask too many questions about the nature of the freight he carried, and he had been observed in conversation with John Vale during the visitor's stay. Monroe believed the ledgers, if they existed in this area, were being moved through Fenwick's operation, possibly concealed in a regular freight shipment heading north to Kansas, where Crane still had allies. If the shipment could be identified and intercepted before it left the Territory, the evidence could be secured without anyone in Dusty Creek being placed in direct danger. Edith's role was simpler than Monroe wanted and more important than he initially admitted. She knew the particular accounting cipher her father had used in his ledgers, a personal system Gerald Monroe had taught her when she was helping him with books as a young woman, a system he had invented himself and used consistently. If the federal ledgers were structured through Gerald Monroe's records, they might use the same cipher, and being able to read them quickly would be essential to using them legally in prosecution. "You're not going anywhere near the freight operation," Monroe told her. "I know," she said. "I'm here, I'm the cipher key." "And you're safe," he said in a tone that was not quite professional. "And I'm safe," she agreed, with a look that acknowledged what was underneath the professionalism. They were finding their way back toward each other. Not quickly. Edith was not a woman who rushed the repair of things that mattered, but steadily. In the evenings, Monroe still walked her home. The conversations were different now, fuller, with the new heaviness of shared knowledge, but also more honest than anything that had come before. The hidden motive had been removed from the equation. There was nothing between them now that wasn't entirely real. One evening, sitting on the schoolhouse steps in the gold September light, he said, "I have not known how to want things in a long time. Normal things, a home, someone beside me." He was looking at his hands, that habitual gesture of a man examining his own history. "I made peace a long time ago with the idea that the work was sufficient, that doing the work well was what a man like me got to have." "What kind of man is a man like you?" she asked. One who came out of bad origins with bad habits and a record, he said. One who works in violence and risk and carries things that aren't conducive to he stopped. Conducive to this. To this meaning, she said softly. He looked at her sideways, something quiet and luminous moving across his usually guarded face. To this meaning he said. To this meaning something worth wanting that requires me to be another stop. That requires me to be worth wanting in return. Edith moved slightly closer to him on the step. Monroe Sutton, she said, you are one of the most worth-wanting people I have ever met. You are honest and careful and thorough, and when you decide to trust someone, you give them something so rare and so real that she stopped herself, aware that her voice had changed. You gave me something real. Even before you were supposed to, even when it complicated your assignment, that matters to me. He reached over and took her hand, which was a small gesture from him but felt enormous. They sat like that until the sun went down, and it felt like a beginning again, a cleaner beginning, the kind that knew what it was made of. The break in the case came in late September, on a Thursday morning when Pete Aldrin came running to the sheriff's office with a piece of information he'd stumbled onto while conducting entirely routine business at Fenwick's freight yard. He'd seen a manifest. A routine shipping manifest for a cargo heading north. But in the column for contents, in handwriting that meant nothing to Pete Aldrin but meant everything to Monroe Sutton, was a phrase that matched a term from the investigation notes. Monroe brought the manifest to Edith, who was at the schoolhouse during the midday break. She looked at it for 30 seconds. This is my father's shorthand, she said. This notation here, this is the code he uses for financial documents. This shipment contains paper documents, not physical freight. How certain are you? Completely certain, she said. This is not a coincidence. I've seen this notation 100 times. Monroe was at the telegraph office within 20 minutes, sending a coded message to the territory office in Albuquerque. The response came back that afternoon. 2 federal deputies and the deputy U.S. Marshal were already on their way by rail to Dusty Creek. They would arrive the following morning. The shipment leaves tomorrow afternoon, Monroe told Edith that evening. We intercept it before it leaves. We have enough now for warrants on Fenwick and through the chain on Crane and your father. Edith was quiet for a moment. My father, she said. Monroe watched her carefully. Yes. He knew what he was, she said. He knew what he'd done. He chose it. A pause. I've had 2 years to make my peace with it. I'm not going to fall apart now. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel, he said. I know, she said. What I feel is that this is right, that the people who were harmed by this deserve a reckoning. That my father made choices and choices have consequences. She looked at Monroe, and I feel that I want this to be over so we can figure out what comes next. He looked at her with a directness that could have scorched stone. So do I, he said. The following morning arrived with a cool clarity that felt appropriate for a day of reckoning. The federal deputies, a man named Harris and another named Cole, arrived on the 7 o'clock train and conferred with Monroe for an hour at the sheriff's office, going over the plan for the interception. The plan was simple. Fenwick's freight shipment was scheduled to depart at 3 in the afternoon, loaded onto wagons heading north. Monroe and the federal men would present the warrant and take custody of the shipment at the yard. If the documents were what the manifest cipher indicated, they would be secured as evidence immediately. If Fenwick resisted, they had the numbers and the legal authority to manage it. The part of the plan that Monroe had not shared with anyone, because he had not put it into plan form, was that he intended to be the first person through the yard gate, standing directly between any potential threat and Edith Monroe. Even though Edith Monroe was 3 blocks away in the schoolhouse teaching arithmetic to 15-year-olds and was in no direct physical danger. The interception went cleanly. Doyle Fenwick, faced with a federal warrant and 3 armed deputies, folded faster than a hand of bad cards. The crate identified by the manifest cipher contained, as Edith had said with complete certainty it would, a substantial collection of financial documents, ledgers, correspondence, and records of payments that, when Edith was brought in to work through the cipher that evening, proved to contain everything the Federal Territory Office had been building toward for 3 years. Her hands were steady as she went through the pages, translating the coded notations, making notes in a clear schoolteacher's hand beside each entry. Monroe sat at the desk opposite her and watched her do it, and the look on his face, which he was no longer trying to keep closed, was something she felt rather than saw, a warmth at the edge of her peripheral vision. "This is it," she said finally, 2 hours into the work. "This is everything. My father's payments going back 9 years. Crane's authorization on each transaction. Names, dates, amounts. This is an airtight case." Harris looked over her shoulder and let out a low breath. "That's correct," he said. "That's exactly what we needed." "Then it's done," Edith said. She set down her pen and looked across at Monroe Sutton, and something passed between them, the particular shared relief of two people who have been carrying something large and finally set it down. The telegrams went out that night. Gerald Monroe was arrested in Harrowfield, Kansas 2 days later, in the morning at his home, by federal deputies presenting a warrant. Ellis Crane was arrested in Texas 4 days after that, with the ledger evidence sealing what had previously been difficult to prosecute. The case moved quickly after that, the way cases moved when the evidence was thorough and the crimes were significant. Edith received a letter from a federal attorney 2 weeks later, informing her that her testimony was not required, that the documentary evidence was sufficient, and expressing the Territory Office's gratitude for her assistance in deciphering the materials. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Gerald Monroe, her father the magistrate in the Sunday suit, the man she had loved as a child, the man who had looked at her and told her to forget what she thought she knew, would stand trial in the spring. She would not be there. She had done what she could and released it, the way you release things that were too heavy to carry while also walking forward. She went to the school and taught her children their letters and their numbers and their history, and she came home in the afternoon light, and Monroe Sutton was sitting on the fence outside the hotel, waiting. He stood when he saw her coming. He looked at her the way he had learned to let himself look at her fully, without reservation, with everything he had spent 31 years keeping too carefully behind walls. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't know whether to feel relieved or sad or both." "Both seems accurate," he said. She walked up to him and he reached out and put his hands on her face the way he had in the rain 3 months ago, and she leaned into it, the solid, warm realness of him. "Monroe," she said. "Edith," he said. "What do we do now?" she asked. "With normal life, now that there isn't a case and a secret and a reason for both of us to be complicated." He made a low, quiet sound that might have been the beginnings of a laugh, rare and warm. "I expect we continue as we have been," he said. "Only with less complication." "Is that what you want?" she said. "To continue?" "More than that," he said. "I want—" He stopped in the old way. Then he started again in the new way, the way he had been learning. "I want to build something permanent. I have never wanted anything permanent before. I find that I very much want it now." She looked up at him, this hard, difficult, extraordinary man. "With me," she said. "Only with you," he said. "There is no version of any of this that isn't specifically you." She kissed him first this time, on a clear October afternoon on the main street of Dusty Creek with absolutely no rain required. And Clara Hatch, watching from the hotel window, made a small victorious sound and went to tell Sam Delray that he owed her $2. October passed and November arrived, and with it came the cooler air that the New Mexico Territory's high desert produced: crisp mornings, warm afternoons, nights that were genuinely cold and reminded you that winter was a real thing even this far south. Monroe Sutton had a conversation with Clara Hatch about the availability of a small house at the edge of town that had been sitting empty since its previous occupant moved north to Colorado. Clara Hatch owned the house. Clara Hatch was perfectly willing to let it to a reliable deputy with steady employment who was courting her most valued boarder. The negotiation was conducted entirely in Clara's characteristic manner, which meant Monroe came away from it slightly overwhelmed and in possession of a rental agreement, a key, and Clara's strongly expressed views on the subject of proper intentions. "She told me," Monroe said to Edith that evening with a slightly dazed expression, "that if I intended to keep company with you in any serious way, I should consider making myself properly settled and respectable in this community, because a schoolteacher with your standing deserved a man who wasn't going to blow away like tumbleweed." "Clara has opinions," Edith said. "Strong ones." "She's entirely correct," Monroe said. "I've taken the house." "You took a house," Edith said. "For the purposes of being settled and respectable," he said. There was something in his face, the particular combination of serious and tentative that she had learned to identify as Monroe Sutton preparing to say something important. "And for the purposes of being in a position to ask you something." "Monroe," she said. "I am not a man who does this gracefully," he said. "I am not a man who knows the formal language of it. But I know very clearly, very completely, that you are the first person in my life who has known the difficult parts of me and stayed, who understood the history and didn't retreat from it, who sat with me in silence and in darkness and in the worst of what I had to tell you and didn't change the fundamental way you looked at me." He took her hands. "I want to be your husband. I want to build this life beside you, in this town, in this territory, for as long as we both have. I am asking you to marry me." Edith Monroe looked at the man who had been the hardest man to know in the territory, and she thought about the first time she had seen him, contained and closed and impossible seeming, and she thought about every specific moment of his opening. The fence in the evening, the rain, the schoolhouse steps, the terrible honesty of the night she had walked through the sheriff's office door with a broken heart, and he had refused to hide from it. She had learned every part of him. The dark ones and the brilliant ones and the quiet ones and the ones that didn't have names. She had done it slowly, patiently, with the same attention she gave to anything that mattered, and what she had found was this: a man of extraordinary worth, hidden under years of necessary armor, who had never fully believed he deserved to put the armor down. "Yes," she said. "Completely, entirely yes." Monroe Sutton exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for 31 years. They were married in December of 1882, on a Saturday, in the small white church on Dusty Creek's Main Street, with a congregation that consisted of essentially everyone in town, because Clara Hatch had told everyone in town, and nobody was going to miss it. Sam Delray stood up for Monroe, solid and beaming. Clara Hatch cried throughout the ceremony with the satisfied tears of a woman whose matchmaking instincts had been vindicated. The 32 students of the Dusty Creek School had made a banner that said "Congratulations, Miss Monroe and Mr. Sutton" in letters of varying size and enthusiasm, and hung it outside the church without asking anyone's permission. The ceremony was simple. The minister was brief and meant it. Monroe said his words looking directly at Edith with an unwavering steadiness that made something tighten in her chest with pure happiness. She said hers clearly and without hesitation, meaning each one completely. When the minister said they were married, Monroe Sutton kissed his wife with the same thoroughness and certainty he had demonstrated in the rain in July, and the congregation of Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, responded with an enthusiasm that rattled the church windows. They spent their first winter in the small house that smelled of cedar and dry grass, learning the dailiness of each other. Monroe was a neat housekeeper in the way of a man who had lived alone long enough to develop systems. He woke early and had coffee made before Edith was downstairs, and she came to love those mornings, the particular quiet of the house before the day began, the two of them at the kitchen table with coffee cups, and the sounds of the territory waking up outside. He was still not given to easy conversation in the mornings. That had not changed, but he had developed a way of communicating a great deal with small gestures. The coffee placed exactly as she liked it, a hand at her back when she passed, a look across the table that contained paragraphs. He told her things still. In the way he had always told her things carefully, at his own pace, trusting her with them when he was ready. She learned over the winter months the rest of the history he carried, the specific incidents from his years of bad company that still sat in his chest like stones, the face of the homesteader woman he hadn't saved, the names of the brothers he had lost touch with and had not allowed himself to find because he hadn't felt worthy of finding them. "You could write to them," she said one February evening, with the fire going and the desert cold pressing at the windows. "It has been 8 years," he said. "People want to know their brothers are alive," she said. "Especially brothers from the kind of home you described. All 4 of you survived that and scattered. I think you would find that they are carrying some of the same things you are." He considered this for a long time. Then he said, "You may be right. Write a letter," she said. "I'll help you if you want." In March of 1883, Monroe Sutton wrote a letter to his youngest brother Thomas, addressed to the last town in Missouri where he had any information about Thomas's whereabouts. The letter took 4 drafts and 3 evenings. It was not long. It said that Monroe was alive and well, and had taken a wife and a position in the New Mexico Territory, and that he had thought of Thomas often, and that he would be glad to hear he was well if Thomas was of a mind to write back. A reply came 6 weeks later. Thomas Sutton was alive, living in St. Louis, working at a freight company. He was 26 years old and married with 1 child. He was, from the tone of his letter, overwhelmed with relief. Monroe read the letter twice and then set it face down on the kitchen table and sat quietly for a moment. Edith watched him, and what she saw on his face was the particular quality of a man being unexpectedly given something back that he had believed permanently lost. "He's well," Monroe said. "I'm so glad," she said. He looked at her. "You knew this would help." "I hoped it would," she said. "How did you know?" he said. "How did you know what I needed when I couldn't see it myself?" She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Because I know you," she said simply. The trial of Gerald Monroe in Harrowfield, Kansas took place in April of 1883. Edith did not attend. She received regular correspondence from the federal attorney keeping her informed of proceedings, and she read the letters in the privacy of their bedroom, and then came out with her face composed and her spine straight. And Monroe held her each time without asking her to explain what she felt, because he understood by now that she felt many things at once, and that his task was to be present beside it, not to analyze it. Gerald Monroe was found guilty on 7 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and accepting bribes from criminal enterprises. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Ellis Crane received a federal sentence of 15 years on multiple counts in 2 territories. The day the verdicts came through by telegram, Edith stood in the kitchen for a long moment after Monroe showed her the message. She was quiet in a way that was not distress, more like a breath held and finally released. "It's done," she said, "properly done." "Yes," he said. "Those families," she said. "The homesteaders, the people whose land was stolen and whose cases were lost because my father was in Crane's pocket. They'll at least know the truth." "They will," he said. She turned and looked at her husband, the man she had learned, the man who had proven to be entirely worth the difficulty of learning, and said, "I think I'd like something to celebrate with, not the verdict exactly, more that this particular weight has been put down." "What did you have in mind?" "Supper at Sam and Nell's," she said. "And dancing if there's dancing." There was dancing. Sam Delray's house was full of warmth and lamplight, and the fiddle music that the New Mexico Territory produced in abundance when people gathered with good reason. And Monroe Sutton danced with his wife with a careful formal competence that suggested a man who had practiced when no one was watching, which she was almost certain he had. He held her like something that mattered. He danced with the same contained deliberateness he brought to everything, and she loved him for it so completely it was almost difficult to stand upright. "You practiced," she said into his shoulder. "I have no idea what you mean," he said. "Monroe," a brief silence. "I may have practiced," he admitted. She laughed, full and real, and felt him hold her more tightly at the sound of it. By the summer of 1883, Edith was expecting their first child. She had suspected for 3 weeks before she said anything, partly from the reasonable caution of a woman wanting to be certain, and partly from the experience of watching Monroe Sutton process surprising information, which he did slowly and needed space for. She told him on a Sunday morning in June, with the sun coming through the kitchen windows and both of them at the table with coffee, and the unhurried quality of a day without obligations. She said it plainly, as she said everything plainly. "I believe we're expecting a child." Monroe Sutton set down his coffee cup with great care. He said nothing for perhaps 30 seconds, which from him was not unusual, but the quality of the silence was different, not guarded, not processing, just very full. "A child," he said. "In December, I think," she said. "Near Christmas." He looked at her, and what was on his face was something she had not seen there before, something undefended and enormous, too large for his usual expressions to contain. It looked like wonder. "Edith," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "I don't." He stopped again. "I have never another stop." "I am very glad," he said finally, and the simplicity of it was exactly right. She reached across the table. He took her hand and held it, and they sat in the Sunday morning sun and were very glad together. Monroe Sutton's particular form of expectant fatherhood looked like this. He fixed every structural deficiency of the small house, including several that Edith had not noticed, and he had apparently been cataloging since November. He read a medical text he obtained by mail order from a bookseller in Santa Fe, which he kept somewhat furtively under the bed, until Edith found it and told him she thought it was admirable. He became quietly, firmly protective in public, not overbearing, not controlling, but present in a way that communicated that the person beside him was not to be unnecessarily jostled or inconvenienced, which, given his size and his particular quality of still authority, meant it was communicated without words and generally respected. And he talked to her, more than he ever had. In the evenings when they sat together, he talked about the child, about what he hoped for them, about what he was afraid of, about the particular terror of a man with difficult origins passing anything from those origins forward, and about the things he intended to do differently. "You will not be your father," Edith said, firmly and clearly, on the evening he articulated this fear most directly. "How do you know?" he said, not argumentatively, genuinely. "Because your father didn't lie awake worrying about it," she said. "Because bad fathers don't read medical textbooks and fix structural deficiencies and ask me every 3 days whether I'm comfortable. Because the man you've built yourself into is nothing like what you came from. You built it deliberately, from scratch, with full understanding of what you were building away from." She held his gaze. "And because you love this child already in a way I can see, and love is the beginning of doing right by someone." Monroe was quiet for a long time. Then, "I am going to be better for them than anyone was for me." "I know," she said. "So am I." On December 8, 1883, their son was born. The midwife Clara Hatch had arranged a capable woman named Adelaide Reeves, who had brought most of Dusty Creek into the world, declared him healthy and strong with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of a professional for whom this was excellent routine news. He arrived in the early morning, in the gray before dawn, and the first sound he made in the world filled the bedroom of the small cedar house and filled Monroe Sutton with something he had no prior framework for, and would never fully find the right word to describe. Monroe held his son for the first time standing by the window in the early light, with the same careful, complete attention he brought to everything that mattered, and this child was, he understood in the marrow of his bones, the most important thing he would ever hold. Edith watched him from the bed, exhausted and luminous, and thought that of all the things she had learned about Monroe Sutton, all the difficult, particular, guarded, brilliant things, this was perhaps the most important, that he was capable of this, of opening to this degree, of standing in the early morning light with his son against his chest and his face completely undone with love. "What shall we call him?" Monroe said. "I thought Jacob," Edith said, "for Marshall fell." The man who gave you the chance to become who you are." Monroe looked at her over the head of their son, and the gratitude in that look was not only for the name. "Jacob," he said. "Yes." Jacob Sutton learned to walk in the spring of 1884, with the specific determination of a child who had absorbed his parents' general approach to difficult endeavors: careful, deliberate, persistent. He was a solemn baby who became a sociable toddler, and he was devoted to his father with an animal directness that Monroe received with a bashful, helpless warmth that Edith found endlessly charming. Monroe continued his work as deputy marshal, and the territory continued its gradual evolution through the 1880s. The arrival of more settlers, the growing complexity of territory law, the slow resolution of long-standing conflicts over land and water rights that had shaped the region's violent history. He was good at his work in the way that mattered most in the territory, not through force primarily, but through the particular authority of a man whom other men could see was entirely without pretense, who said what he meant and did what he said and could not be bought or frightened. Edith continued to teach, and her school grew as the town grew, and she became, without particularly trying to and without any diminishment of her essential self, a figure of considerable standing in Dusty Creek, respected by parents and adored by children, known for a manner of patient, honest clarity that made difficult things approachable. She also continued to know her husband. She knew him better every year. The things he was still learning to do, to receive care as well as give it, to accept help when he needed it, to let people close without immediately calculating the risk. He improved at all of these things with the same deliberate commitment he brought to anything he decided to do. He was not transformed. He was still Monroe Sutton, quiet and contained and difficult to read until you knew how to read him. But within the framework of who he was, he had made room for a life full of warmth and connection and love. He wrote to his brother Thomas regularly, and in the summer of 1884, Thomas Sutton and his wife came to visit Dusty Creek, a journey of several days by rail from Missouri, because Monroe had asked them and Thomas had said yes immediately. The reunion was not easy in the way comfortable things were easy, but it was real and valuable in the way hard things were valuable. There were conversations that had been postponed for 8 years, acknowledged pain and shared surviving of a difficult childhood, and the particular solidity of 2 grown men who had come through the same fire and were standing on the other side of it, looking at each other and feeling something settle. Edith left them alone for most of it, because that was what the moment needed, and she saw the after-effects in Monroe, a loosening of something old, a particular lightness in the set of his shoulders. He never talked much about what was said between himself and Thomas. What he said once was, "I am glad I wrote the letter." "I know," Edith said, "you knew I would be." "I hoped," she said, "but also, yes, I knew you would be." In the autumn of 1885, Edith told Monroe she was expecting again. This time he did not go quiet for 30 seconds. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her, which was a measure of how much had changed. Their second child, a girl they named Clara over Clara Hatch's vociferous and entirely false protests that this was completely unnecessary, and she was not at all moved, arrived in April of 1886 with considerably more speed and efficiency than Jacob had, and was a different proposition entirely from the first moment. Louder, more decided, possessed of opinions, she communicated unmistakably before she had language to express them. Monroe, who had adapted magnificently to Jacob's solemn thoughtfulness, adapted with visible bemusement to Clara's declarative personality. She was 18 months old before she learned to be even slightly intimidated by his stillness, and the solution she arrived at was to simply disregard it, climbing into his lap and demanding his attention with a directness that bypassed his entire system of careful distance management. He was, Edith observed with tremendous happiness, completely incapable of resisting it. "She has your stubbornness," he told Edith one evening, with Clara asleep on his chest despite having been put to bed twice already. "She has yours too," Edith said. "She decided something was going to happen and she made it happen regardless of opposition. That is a Sutton quality." Monroe looked down at his sleeping daughter with the same expression she had seen when he held Jacob for the first time, that enormous, undefended wonder. "She is extraordinary," he said. "Both of them are," Edith said. "Both of them are," he agreed. The years settled into themselves. 1887 brought a drought that tested everyone in the territory, and Monroe worked long hours helping to manage the consequences: disputes over water, the particular cruelties that scarcity produced in people, the work of keeping a community from fracturing under pressure. Edith organized the school families into a practical support network, the kind of community action that had always come naturally to her. Together they moved through the hard season with the same quality they brought to everything, steadily, side by side, without pretending it was easy. In the spring of 1888, Monroe received a letter from Jacob Marshall Fell of Albuquerque, now retired but still formidable, suggesting that the territory deputy marshal position was evolving, and that Monroe might consider moving into a more senior role, taking on broader responsibility for the region. The letter was a recognition of 15 years of work, a statement of trust from a man whose trust Monroe valued above most professional opinions. He brought the letter to Edith without telling her what it contained, handing it across the breakfast table and watching her read it. "This would mean more travel," he said when she looked up. "More time away from home, at least in transition periods. It would mean higher authority and higher exposure. I'm not going to take it without discussing it." "What do you want?" she asked. He considered. "I think the work at this scale matters. I think I can do it. I think," a pause, "I think I want to do it." "Then do it," she said. "It's not just my Monroe," she said. "We have built something together that does not require you to be physically present every moment to be real. The children know their father. I know my husband. More responsibility does not frighten me. Do the work you're suited for." "You are very straightforward," he said. "I have learned," she said, "from a man who values directness." He looked at her across the breakfast table in the good morning light, in their house that smelled of cedar and coffee and the particular warmth of a life fully inhabited, and there was on his face what she had put there, not recently, but over years, over the long patient work of knowing him, a happiness that was entirely his own and entirely real. He wrote to Marshall Fell that afternoon accepting the position. By 1889, Dusty Creek had grown enough to justify a second teacher at the school, and Edith hired a young woman from Denver named Margaret Hill who was earnest, capable, and slightly terrified of the frontier, which reminded Edith, with a fond private amusement, of herself in April of 1882. She took Margaret under her wing with the same steady attention she gave to everything, and watched the young woman find her footing with the satisfaction of a person who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere new and discover you had more than enough for it. The school was her life's work in the way Monroe's work was his, not all of her, but the part of her that existed out in the world and made a mark on it. She had taught children for 7 years and watched them grow and leave, and some of them right back, which was better evidence of impact than any prize. She was good at it in the bone-deep way that comes from genuine vocation. She understood how children thought. She knew how to make hard things approachable without making them smaller, and she really believed, with a conviction she traced to nothing more complex than everything she had experienced, that the education of a child was the most consequential long-term project available to a human being. The autumn of 1889 brought one more unexpected thing: a letter from Harrowfield, Kansas. Not from Gerald Monroe, who was still serving his prison sentence and had not attempted to contact his daughter since the trial. This letter was from a woman named Agnes Porter, who had been Edith's nearest neighbor in Harrowfield and had known her since she was 7 years old. Agnes Porter wrote that the town of Harrowfield was, slowly, recovering from the long shadow of the revelation about its former magistrate. That several families who had been wronged in land disputes connected to Crane's operation had had their cases reviewed, and in 2 instances their property restored. That people spoke of Edith with respect, as the woman who had had the courage to leave, and in leaving had eventually made justice possible. Edith sat with this letter for a long time. She had not framed what she'd done as courageous. She had framed it as surviving, and then as acting when the moment required action, and then as loving a man who needed to be loved honestly. She had not set out to be anything except herself, as fully and honestly as she could manage. She showed the letter to Monroe that evening. He read it and looked at her. "She's right," he said. "It feels like too much credit," Edith said. "It isn't," he said. "You could have stayed, you could have kept quiet. You could have decided that what you knew was too dangerous to act on. Instead you left, and you told the truth when the truth was required, and you let the law do what it's supposed to do." He held her gaze. "That took more than most people have." "I had help," she said. "Some," he agreed quietly. She folded the letter and put it in the small box where she kept things she wanted to keep, and she went to stand beside her husband at the window of their house in the last light of an autumn evening in the territory she had made her home, and she felt completely, settledly, without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Their 3rd child arrived in June of 1890, a boy they named Samuel, for Sam Delray, who had by this point declared himself the unofficial patriarch of the Sutton-Monroe family axis, and accepted the honor with tears he claimed were dust in his eyes. Samuel was smaller than Jacob had been and louder than Clara, a combination that struck Monroe as personally aimed, but which he managed with the patient, devoted attention he gave to all 3 of his children. Jacob at 7 was learning to read with the intensity of a child who had discovered what reading was for, and Monroe spent evenings sitting with him at the kitchen table with books, which Edith watched from across the room with a warmth that had no bottom. Clara at 4 had entered a philosophical phase in which she asked unanswerable questions with great seriousness, and Monroe answered all of them with equal seriousness, which Edith knew was the right approach, and also found quietly hilarious. Samuel was new and demanding and entirely himself from the first day, and he was held and fed and loved with the uncomplicated abundance of parents who had done this before, and knew the value of this exact stage of impossibly small and precious. Clara Hatch, who was 62 years old and had outlasted 2 husbands and the opinions of everyone who told her how to run her hotel, attended the small gathering they held to mark Samuel's arrival and cried through the whole thing, and said it was categorically the last time she was going to cry at a Sutton occasion, which everyone present correctly identified as a complete untruth. Monroe Sutton stood in the parlor of the house he had rented and then bought outright, with his 3rd child in his arms and his other 2 children pressed against his sides, and his wife sitting in the chair by the window with the particular glowing stillness of a woman who was exhausted and completely happy. And he thought about the man who had ridden into this territory in 1881 with nothing but an assignment and a closed heart. That man had not known how to want things. He had made peace with limitation and called it wisdom. He had been wrong, and being wrong had saved him. He looked at Edith. She was looking back at him in the way she had learned to look at him, fully, without reservation, with everything she was, and he thought about the evening on the fence when she had stopped instead of walking past, and the kitchen table with the investigation files spread between them, and the rain, and the terrible honest night she had walked through the sheriff's office door and demanded the truth, and the morning he had asked her to marry him in the inadequate words of a man who didn't know the formal language of it. And every ordinary, extraordinary morning since then. He had been the hardest man to know in the territory. She had learned every part of him anyway. Not because he had made it easy. Not because the history was clean or the walls were thin or the opening hadn't cost them both something, but because she was Edith Monroe, who was patient and honest and stubborn in the best possible way, who looked at difficult things without flinching and waited for them to show her what they were, who had packed her trunk in Harrowfield and arrived in Dusty Creek, and without planning any of it, had entirely rearranged the shape of one man's life. "Thank you," Monroe said, quietly, in the warmth of the room full of people they loved. Edith looked at him across the space between them, and smiled the way she smiled when she knew exactly what he meant without him saying more of it, which was frequently. "You're welcome," she said. "All of it." Outside, the New Mexico Territory was going about its evening business. The last light on the red rock, the dry, cool air coming down from the mountains, the particular enormous sky that made some people feel very small and some people feel entirely free. In the parlor of the Cedar House, a man who had been the hardest man to know held his youngest son and stood beside his other children and looked at his wife, and felt, in the clean, honest fullness of it, every single thing he had once told himself he would never have. It was all exactly as she had always said it would be. Both things at once.